Well, as Nanette said, my name is Curly Raven Houghton, and I'm the Executive Director of the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland. And I'd like to thank her and the museum for inviting us to be a part of this celebration of the Harlem Renaissance. But let me tell you a little bit about the David C. Driscoll Center and then Dr. Driscoll, whose name the center bears. The center honors Dr. Driscoll and his legacy and his groundbreaking work on the study and the documentation of African American artists. He is considered a foremost authority, especially with his seminal texts, 2 Centuries of African American Artists, 1750 to 1950. Many scholars had no knowledge that artists of color were working in the United States during that time. So Dr. Driscoll has not only educated the community that appreciated art, but also the scholars that taught art had to come to Dr. Driscoll to find out about the fullest story of the American dream, and we often talk about that. So this conversation is going to be not so purely academic, but a little more intimate, a little more personal, and I'll try to draw out of him some tidbits from stories and encounters with some of the most important artists and cultural historians that have worked in the U.S. So the David C. Driscoll Center, and of course, Dr. Driscoll. This is some of the background, and Nanette had spoken to you about David's important background and how he got to become such a singular and important figure in America. We consider Dr. Driscoll to be a national treasure. So the title of this talk is Living Legacy, a conversation with Dr. David C. Driscoll, artist and scholar, and a national treasure. Dr. Driscoll, who recently received one of the nation's highest honors and prestigious awards by being inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Prior to that, I think 2 years ago, he was inducted to the National Academy of Art as a new member. This is amazing because not only has he had a stellar career as an art historian, but as a studio practicing artist at the same time. And that's how I was first introduced to Dr. Driscoll. So we're on this national tour. We're taking his story around the country, a story of cultural and artistic achievement that celebrates the African American journey through the eyes, experiences, and voice of Dr. Driscoll. Many of you already know of Dr. Driscoll's amazing career and legacy as a seminal figure in the study of African American art and his contributions to the larger artistic canon. We had a number of individuals at lunch today. We're so pleased to see David. They knew people over the years that he had a relationship with. And what came out of that lunch was the importance of sharing these stories with each other. Not all these stories are written down, but when we tell the story, personally tell the story through a narrative, it allows us to connect with that human experience. David has written a lot, has spoke a lot, has been published in many journals, exhibition catalogs, but we've been inspired to share that story in the most intimate and personal way, to hear his voice tell those stories, and what he's witnessed along that long journey is very important. This is a human story of triumphs, an American story of faith, and a story of our long journey of hope and courage. When we look to the culture and artistic accomplishments of the African American community, we often turn to that special moment in history situated between 3 national defining events: the Great Migration of Blacks from the South to the North, the beginning of World War I, and of course the Great Depression. This volatile social environment composed of continued racial segregation, discrimination in housing and labor, returning Black GIs who had fought heroically in the battlefields of Europe, a group of visionary Black intellectual leaders who offered a new vision of an old stereotypical Negro. Now coined the New Negro movement, this transformative artistic and cultural crucible, although brief when we look at it, became extremely popular and known as the Harlem Renaissance. Dr. Driscoll is a child of the Harlem Renaissance. Many of his teachers and mentors were participants in that movement, and a number of them were considered the founders of the Harlem Renaissance, such as Elaine Locke and Langston Hughes. Here we see David as a student, 1953. Now, David was a student at Howard University. which is an amazing story in itself, how he got to Howard University. I'm going to try to draw that out because he arrived in a classroom without being enrolled as a student. He was going to college. They said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "I'm going to college." Well, you can't just come in and sit in the classroom. He had taken a train from Georgia or North Carolina, with a little sack with some tomatoes that he had grew himself for lunch along the way. I think $5 or $20, something like that. He was going to college. No entrance exam, no application, but he was going to college. And eventually I allowed him to come to Howard University. But the Harlem Renaissance, which is a great symbol of the Renaissance, this photograph is in the exhibition by James Van der Zee. So this was a glorious moment where you had an intersection of labor, intelligentsia, and cultural opportunity located in one site, and Little Africa is what they called it. It was the largest number of African Americans or Africans outside of Africa, located in any location outside of Africa, was this Little Africa, Harlem. That was critically important because not only did you have a major doctor in one apartment building, you had Cab Calloway on another apartment building, you had a janitor next door, all living in the same environment. I think those are critical elements. The next image, Langston Hughes. Perhaps the mission of the artist is to interpret beauty to people, the beauty within ourselves. And I think David has always attempted to do that, to give to the public the beauty of black people. Here's David. Before we get to David, the Post of the Negro would begun to beat in Harlem by Langston Hughes and Elaine Locke, who was also someone that defined the Harlem Renaissance. And next you'll see Dr. Driscoll with a number of individuals in DC, the Bernard Aden Gallery. You see him to the left, this young man? It's Dr. Driscoll there. So he was around these individuals that had a legacy and a connection to the Harlem Renaissance, and they were transferring that message and story to David. These are artists that David knew personally or dealt with in some kind of professional capacity, so he knew their story. Here he is at Fisk University, Walter Williams, Jacob Lawrence, and Aaron Douglas. So this story that he's going to tell you is a story about personally being related and engaged with these artists, not just a historical document, but a witnessing, and that's important. And he knew a number of these cultural heroes. Here you have him with Romare Bearden, Aaron Douglas, Carlton Moss. Look at how he's posing here, isn't that interesting? Here is with Aaron Douglas and Erna Bontemps, who was at Fisk University, had just finished at Fisk when David came to Fisk. He just retired, so there was a relationship and a connection. And he worked with most of these individuals. So this was an important period for David to set the foundation for his own work, the golden period of the Harlem Renaissance. So David was born on June 7, 1931 in Eatonton, Georgia, to a family of sharecroppers. And I'm sure no one in Eatonton had heard of the Harlem Renaissance. But he made up for that in his travels and his journeys. He educated himself, and he was motivated to tell that story. Not just his story and the story of his colleagues and other artists, but he wanted to tell the story of his family. He wanted to bring that story forward, that he had something to be proud of and to celebrate and not to apologize for. Historically, African Americans have been asked to negotiate their presence and value in public constantly, to defend and assert their value that was always questioned and suspect. But David came from an environment of great pride and encouragement and support. And at this moment, I'd like to bring the maestro to the stage. Dr. David C. Driscoll. So I have a few formal questions that I'll ask him to get him going. And then I'll let him loose, all right? Because he has stories to tell you. But I think one that's been really important to me is when you think about a generation of artists that in most cases had no models to encourage them to make art. They studied, many of them, not all of them had a chance to study, but they had great faith in their talent and they were motivated to create works of art. They were motivated to document their reality, that new Negro. Not the old Negro that was apologetic, ashamed, and guilt-ridden by the stain of color. These individuals were asserting a different kind of value, a different kind of reality. So the first question I want to ask Dr. Driscoll is to talk a little bit about how the Harlem Renaissance set this professional foundation that had not existed before, where they were considered artists, exhibitors. And I know during the WPA program, which followed, unless you had an exhibition record, you could not get hired to work in the Works Project Administration. So where were these artists to get an exhibition record if they weren't shown anywhere?
Well, as Curly has said, the period prior to the founding and organization of what became the Harlem Renaissance, the new Negro movement, pride in racial pride, the notion that we were not, as a race, the people who had been depicted in the stereotypes. We were culturally aggressive in that we had certain standards about our lifestyles, our educational principles, etc. And so the new Negro movement was to prove to a very skeptical public that black people had culture that was consistent with the ideals of what would be described as the highest ideals in American culture. And it took what might be referred to as the founding fathers. There were women who were involved also, but the men who were employed in various institutions at that time, such as Charles S. Johnson, Allen Locke, E. Franklin Frazier, and others, they decided that they had to make clear the notion that there was a new Negro on the scene, not the one that had previously been defined with head down and just barely making a statement about his or her livelihood. Du Bois had, of course, already defined that perimeter by saying that it was difficult for African Americans, for black people, to say who they were in the context of the American definition because they had to live in two worlds. They had to be black by the standards of what blackness meant, and they had to try and compete in a world in which the American ideal was education, the hierarchy of living, and so forth and so on. So how are you going to do that if you are denied the privilege to participate fully in the American experience, in American society, in jobs, in education, etc.? And so this double consciousness that Du Bois talked about was characterizing the life of the average, not just the educated, what have you, the talented 10th that he wrote about, but everybody who was considered colored in the United States. Everybody was under one title. And I've often said, and you've heard me say this as we go to audiences around the nation, I don't know whether it's a whether it's a blessing or a curse. I've lived through all kinds of nomenclature of naming. Negro, colored, Afro-American, black, African-American. I don't know what's next. I just like to be human. I just like to be an American because I think I'm one of the proudest Americans out there. I think I've reaped the benefits of the American system in so many ways that I can tell this story and I can assume that you're describing my legacy as something that I can experience in my own lifetime. Now, legacy is supposed to be after.
Well, this one we're doing while you're here. Because we want this story told now.
So, to make a long story short, and he very often has to rein me in when I get started talking. He said, could you get back to the point of what we were talking about? Well, to make a long story short, I'm simply saying that the Harlem Renaissance is the product of a long period of progression. Didn't start in 1918. It started many, many years prior to that, but it couldn't be recognized until you had those people who were able to articulate it and to say exactly what it was. And to a certain extent was, I'm tired, I'm not going to take it anymore. None of the nonsense that's out there. I too sing America. I am an American, and let's prove it by way of our culture, by way of our patriotism. You know, First World War had just taken place and had black soldiers going to Europe, including Tanner and others, artists. And so working its way on into the 20th century, in which you would have the acknowledgement that African Americans had been part and parcel of the cultural scene all along. In some cases, they had done work that had been claimed by their white owners in slavery. They were not given the credit for building the great buildings of the South. And those of you who read the book that the catalog for 2 centuries, one of the examples that I pointed out was the old courthouse in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where one gentleman in his diary points out, he says, yes, I'm given the credit for building that building, but my mechanic slaves, John Jackson built that building. I supervised it. And he was honest enough to say, I got the credit for it. Well, that was common. The plantation houses all over the South, the great houses and what have you. We know the mechanic slaves, as they were very often called. They were the builders. They were the ones who, of course, not only cultivated the crops and harvested the fields and things like that, but none of that was recorded in the compendium. In American society, we know, if it isn't written down, nobody believes it. We are not a part of that great oral tradition from Africa and other such places. Now, African Americans were, because very often that's the way they preserved their history, was through the oral tradition. But if it isn't in print, in our society today, forget it. As far as we're concerned, it didn't happen.
Sure.
So much of that happened that has been lost. And so it was the mission of the writers, of the artists, the poets, the sculptors of the Harlem Renaissance to record, to make sure that their contributions were known. And so they were artists and artisans in all of those fields, many of whom had not been recognized prior. They were the ones who were beginning to be looked upon as creators. And so that was a new kind of thing for black people, and Harlem was the center of it. And from Harlem, it spread out into other parts of the country.
You raise a real good issue here. They brought something with them, not just talent and ambition. They brought something with them. They brought the experience they had had, many as sharecroppers or children from the former plantation. And they had a pride, even though it was impoverished, they had a pride and a sense of history that they did not want to deny and apologize for. So with that, I want to let your story in some way represent our story. if you could, I know we're a little ahead when we're talking about meeting these artists and being inspired by them and working with them. Could you take us back a little bit to your early days in the South, in Edenton? You went to a segregated school, one-room schoolhouse, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us how you got from Edenton to Howard University?
Well, you don't have 4 hours, but I will try and do it in.
Because I've had to listen to it, but anyway, do the edited version, all right?
I'll try and do it in 4 minutes. How about that? Well, Edenton, Georgia, you know, people say, where in the world is that? Well, it's like 20 miles from Macon, Georgia. Maybe you've heard of Macon, Georgia. James Brown came from, you know, that part of the world, and Macon, Augusta, and they had names that you have some popular American heroes that would be connected. Edenton was a little sleepy town of about 15,000 people, and about 60 miles southeast of Atlanta. And as I said, closer to Macon, which is the largest city in the area. And as far as I can go back, I can trace my ancestry back to around 1820, when a slave by the name of John Driscoll, in biblical terms, begat a son by the name of Douglas Driscoll, and then by 1872 or so forth, begat a son by the name of William Driscoll, and William had a son named George Driscoll, and I'm the son of George Driscoll. George was born in 1905, I was born in 1931. Edenton, Georgia. People say, Edenton, why do I know about Edenton? Well, probably because Alice Walker was born there. But I always tell people, well, I was born there before she was. So, the Walker family, my father was a Methodist minister at that time. He was not trained in theology and all of that, but up through the line. And the Walker family was a member of my father's church. I didn't know them because we moved away between my 5th and 6th birthday. So I really didn't attend school there. There was a little one-room schoolhouse near Hunts Chapel Church where my sisters, I had 3 sisters ahead of me. My sisters attended that school, but my parents moved to Western North Carolina, and what we commonly refer to as Appalachia. And I assume they moved there because my mother had relatives who lived there and who were also sharecroppers. And so we became sharecroppers. And there I attended a one-room school, a 4-room high school in which I drove 35 miles on the bus every day up in the mountains, in the hills, going up toward Asheville. 35 miles there, 35 miles back every day, passing about 5 beautiful edifices along the way that I couldn't attend because of my color. And that scenario of being brought up in that environment, but having parents who were encouraging and saying, and my only playmate was a young man, a white kid who lived next door, and that's one of the things that we don't always hear about in the South. Very often, your property is contiguous with the property of a white person or what have you, and you have to get along with that person because that's the way life is. The local whites, 5 or 6 in our community, didn't have a car. My father did. So they would come on Saturday and borrow my father's car to go to town. That kind of cooperation, sure. You never read about that kind of thing, you see. So it wasn't an isolated community where you didn't know any white people, or white people didn't know any black people. It was really a cooperative venture, but it was a limited one. Mm. But you didn't go to school together. You didn't go to the same churches and what have you. But it was a community that was, it's hard to describe it in the sense that you had to cooperate with each other to live there. It was just that difficult. So that was the environment in which I
think that traveled with you, didn't it? That sense of experience, yes, and values.
Yes, and my father being a Methodist minister, in that area, you know, when it comes to religion, people are very careful about their associations. My father was AME, African Methodist Episcopal. There must be some AMEs in here somewhere. But there is AME Zion. At that time, there was CME, Colored Methodist Episcopal. There was also another one, I don't recall. You know, if you have 5 black people, you're going to have 5 different church associations. And so there was no AME church in the area where we moved in Appalachia. So my father became Baptist. So I grew up between these two religious experiences of AME and Baptist. And so when I went to college, I said, I don't like either one of them. Mm-hmm. And I became uppity. And,
tell us how you got to college now. Tell us how you got there.
Well, I became Congregationalist, moved on up a little higher, and so, which is now United Church of Christ. And I got there because I had worked in the fields all summer, saved about $45. I had plowed cotton, chopped cotton, and done all the things that one does in those communities, and saved about $45. And I was the class salutatorian out of my 24 classmates at this little school. And I'll never forget the principal for not making me valedictorian, because I thought I was smarter than anybody else. At least my parents told me I was. So they said, go to college. We hadn't a counselor. There were 5 teachers in this little, counting the principal, in this little 4-room school. But they were good teachers. And I'll tell you something else that you probably didn't know about the black schools in the South. In those days, black students, black teachers, or what have you couldn't attend the white universities. You couldn't come to the Ohio State University. Now, black people in North Carolina, where I grew up, or Georgia, or what have you, could come to Ohio State University. How? Because they couldn't go to the University of North Carolina because of segregation. Yeah. So the state of North Carolina would pay you to come to Columbus, to go to Ohio State University. So we had better teachers because our teachers went to Michigan for graduate work, to Ohio State University, to Columbia, and I'm a product of that period. We had the best teachers. And when, and I'm getting off the subject, but I do that.
You got on the train.
And when, in 2001, when I was down at the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a young man, a Caucasian gentleman, who had graduated from the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, was interviewing me. He was interviewing me on National Public Radio. And he said, now our collection was at the Mint Museum, collection of African American art. He said, now, here you are, X number of years later, you grew up here in Appalachia. Tell me what it was like to go to the Mint Museum when you were a child. And I looked at him like he had come from Mars. I said, didn't you know I couldn't go to the Mint Museum? And he was shocked. He was surprised. He said, you didn't have money to go to the Mint Museum? I said, no. I didn't have the color to go. I'm black. He had never read about that. He'd never heard it. That's not in the books.
I understand.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going around the barn to tell you all of this. So I said, no. And I told him the whole story, and he was just shocked. So you couldn't go to the Mint Museum? No, I couldn't go to the Mint Museum. Then they improved maybe 10 years later, and they had Negro Day. You could go one day a week. So he was just so shocked that here I am, a so-called art expert who didn't have any art training as a child, Went to the museum only late in life on Negro Day, and yet somebody's calling me an authority. He couldn't figure that out. But that was a pattern. So he said, well, aren't you angry? I said, no, what good would anger do? He said, well, I would be angry. I said, no, 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 no. I said, now, the little town, Forest City, North Carolina, in Appalachia, where I went to high school, our high school had 4 rooms. Okay, a principal and 4 teachers. Across town, less than a half-mile away, was Cool Springs High School, with more than 100 rooms and perhaps 50 teachers. And I said, I'm not angry. For one reason is, I've never heard, this was in 2001, I said, I've never heard of a presidential medalist coming from Cool Springs High School. And I came from Grahamtown with 4 rooms. I said, I'm the blessing.
Yes.
I'm the real American.
Right.
Because I too sing America in that sense. I am the example of what it can be.
What can be, what was produced.
And so those schools were reserved for whites only. But in many ways, I'm not holding up segregation or anything like that, don't get me wrong. But I got a good education because I had good teachers. And they went off. I had a 4th grade teacher who had a doctor of education from Michigan, from East Lansing, Michigan State University.
And that continued because you went on to go to Howard.
Went on to Howard, got on the train.
Predominantly black institution.
Black institution.
Called the Black Harvard.
Well, we called it the capstone.
Oh, okay.
The capstone of Negro education, but it was referred to as the Black Harvard. And when we wanted to go downtown, and Washington was segregated then. This is 1949. Only 3 places in Washington where a black person can go and sit down at a restaurant and eat in 1949. National Gallery of Art, thank God for art. The Severin Restaurant at Union Station, and the Methodist Building. So all the Methodists out there, be grateful you were ahead of your time. You could go to those 3 places and eat. You couldn't even eat at a People's Drugstore counter. They'd call the cop. We don't serve coloreds. I said, well, we don't eat them. You know, and then dash out, take off. We take off, right, go in, sit, and then take off.
Yeah.
You know, it is funny now when you look back at it, but this was life in those days. And I got on the train because my teacher said we didn't have any counselors. Everybody taught math, whatever, and he said, go to college. So 18 of us in that 24 got on the train, went to college somewhere. And I went to Howard 3 weeks after they had already been in session. We didn't have any instructions. And I, you know, my report card up and went on up to Howard and said, I'm here to go to college. And they looked at me like I'd come from Mars. But they said, young man, you don't just go to college, you have to make an application. I said, well, I'm here, give me one. Well, I don't think they knew what to do with me, but they didn't call security. And I sat in. I went and started going to classes.
Did you have any idea that you were going into an environment that had professors like James Porter, Lois Mailou Jones, Elaine Locke? Any idea that they were present and what that would mean?
I had never heard those names.
Yeah.
I wasn't even sure that I had a great interest in art. I was going to major in history. So I just went and started sitting in on history. I was the first sit-in, not the Greensboro.
You're the first sit-in?
Yeah, I sat in on history classes.
They call it auditing the class now, but go.
They would call it auditing, but the teachers knew I wasn't enrolled properly. But they didn't ask me to leave. They wouldn't let me take an exam. And I wrote home and I said, I'm in college. So
got some jobs working in college, drove a cab for a while, right?
Well, thank God for the women who look out for crazy men. And I'm going to college. And finally, Miss Fox called me and says, I want to see you in the registrar's office. And I go in, and Miss Fox was an interesting little lady. She seemed like she was inebriated all the time. But she was well enough to tell me what to do and what not to do. And she said, sit down, son, I'm going to tell you. She said, now, first of all, you don't just come to college. She said, you have to make an application. And she went through the whole thing. I'm not paying any attention because I'm in college.
You're there.
I'm there. And she said, but if we were on the quarter system at that time at Howard, she said, if you don't come back, this is in the fall. School had been in session 3 weeks now when I arrived. She said, if you don't come back until January, I will personally usher you through the whole process. I said, thank you, and I went on back to class. But I saved my little money, and I did go back in January, and I was properly enrolled.
Mm-hmm. And you did some part-time work as a cab driver, didn't you tell me that?
I was a cab driver.
Were you driving Langston around Howard?
Well, not until, I didn't drive Langston
later?
Hughes around until he came back to receive an honorary degree. And by that time, I was a faculty member at Howard. Okay. That was 1963.
Oh, I got that mixed up.
Yeah, that was a little later, but I'm on my way to
we going to get there?
We'll get there. Yeah.
So you are studying with James Porter. He is the author of probably the first official text on African American art, modern Negro art, done in 1943. I think he was a graduate student when he started. That was his graduate.
That was his graduate thesis mm-hmm. at Institute of Fine Arts Institute in NYU, but it was published. He got his degree in '39, but it was published in 1943. Okay. So I'm not arriving until later, but by that time he was a professor at Howard. I didn't know him. James Wells was there, Lois Jones, but James Herring was the chairman of the department. And in those days, the students Washington was still a segregated city. We had to go upstairs to go to movies downtown, F Street, and what have you, unless we pretended we were African. Mm-hmm. African students could go to walk right in, speak French or something. We'd go down and say, "Donnez-moi un billet." And he said, "Ticket, you go right on in, But if you just said, "Can I have a ticket?" and they call the police. So we learned all of the tricks. And, the women who could pass were passing. We'd see them going in and out. Isn't that no, that's not. Oh, yeah, I know her ashes if I saw them. That's who it is. We did all those things, the passing, and I wasn't able to. But, the people with fair skin and what have you, we defeated the system. Mm. And the thing about it is the whites didn't know it. And then they had this privilege of recognizing Africans,
Oh, Africans could stay in hotels that were segregated.
Yes, but we couldn't.
But not African Americans.
So we got the word, if you ask for it in French, you get in. Somebody was stupid.
You still speak bad French.
They understood me enough to give me that ticket. But then, and I'm getting ahead of the story, but later on, I get recognized for my lectures and what have you. The State Department and Smithsonian asked me to go to South Africa in 1972 as a guest curator. And I get there and I take the work, and you'll see his work in the exhibition, William H. Johnson. I take a one-person exhibition of the work of William H. Johnson to the South African National Gallery of Art. Apartheid. In 1972, I can't stay at the regular hotels. I have to stay at the best of South African hotels because they can't guarantee my safety.
Right. But then you were honorary white. You had that on your passport, right?
Well, not on my passport, but on my papers. I didn't know that until somebody told me because I couldn't read Afrikaans. And so, but the irony of this, I'm taking the work, just like you have the Harlem Renaissance show here, William H. Johnson's work only, to the South African National Gallery of Art as curator. And I'm treated like I have been doing this all along. You know, they could turn it on and off as they liked it. But
not shown at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington.
we had the first showing, one-person exhibition of an African American at the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 2003. Now, they are my friends. I love them, and they know I love them. But that's history. And the denial of history, as we see it going on the national level, and I'll leave it there, that's the worst thing that could be happening. It was Winston Churchill said, if you deny it, you're going to go back and make that same mistake. So hopefully.
But with that in mind,
Pardon?
with that in mind,
Yes.
you have James Porter and Lois Mailou Jones at Howard.
Yeah.
And they are fighting over you, so to speak.
Well, by that time, I started painting. I left. Porter comes in and sees me. I'm drawing one day in Professor Wells' class. And he looks over my shoulder and he says, "What is your name?" He said, "I haven't seen you here before." And I tell him, "David Driscoll." And he says, "Oh." He said, "What is your major?" I said, "History." And he looked at my drawing and he said, "You don't belong over there, you belong here." So I went and changed my major.
That was the beginning of the art history.
That was the beginning of art history and art in general, with the exception of the course I had taken with Professor Wells. I've always been of the opinion that one should take the leap of faith if it meant improvement. And that's what it meant for me.
Now, in that environment, your talent was being recognized and abilities, and you were offered a scholarship, a very rare scholarship to Skowhegan in painting. I think it had only been 2 African Americans that had been to Skowhegan as students up to that point, if I'm not mistaken. You were one of 2.
Well, I think maybe 3 ahead of me.
That was 1950.
1953.
53.
The school was founded in 1946. And the first African American was a gentleman who is now 95, and he is still painting, and he's a puppeteer. He writes children's books. Ashley Bryan, who lives in Maine. He went to the school in Skowhegan, Maine in 1946. He was the first African American to go there, and I was about the 3rd one, maybe. Howard had a tradition of sending his graduate students there. And I was a junior when I went there, and I was the very first in that category. And I was, I guess, what they call a teacher's pet. And so I had the good fortune of being close to all of those teachers at that time.
Including Lois Mailou Jones.
Including Lois Mailou Jones.
Who was very famous for her painting, A Sin of Ethiopia.
Yes.
During the Harlem Renaissance period.
She was one of the first African Americans in the 20s, really, after the Harlem Renaissance. She's not Harlem Renaissance, but she...
Just shortly after.
Yeah, she was one of the first to really stick with the African theme and the accent of Ethiopia.
Here she is here.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes. Lois,
But you're dealing with teachers and mentors that still have the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance.
yes,
flowing
they
through their
had
work
worked
and their
and
belief.
had worked with Allen Locke, who came to Howard, and with others they had worked as illustrators for Opportunity Magazine, Crisis, The Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So they had these relationships already set up when I met them at Howard. And the name Howard, incidentally, you know, there were times when it was a curse, because you said Howard University, then the assumption was, well, he knows nothing about American culture, period. On the other hand, it was a blessing. You go downtown sometime if they're having a big concert, and let's say the Harvard Glee Club was in town. The Harvard Glee Club, as they say, the Harvard. And you had to go to the door and announce your class. And we'd go in and say, Howard, 1955. And they said, well, you know, use Howard, Harvard. You know, just think you were saying Harvard. You go in
And
without,
you got in, yeah.
without paying, just go on in. So,
Well, with working with, James Porter and Lois Malia Jones, I think they transmitted to you this sense of responsibility. Now, you did arrive, and that's why I talked about your past a little bit and wanted you to go back, is to let everyone know that you arrived with a certain kind of sense of pride and a sort of race pride, that I could demonstrate that I come from some place of value. I had value. You weren't walking around without a doubt about your value. You had value. But with Porter and with Lane Locke, they also gave you a different kind of challenge. I think you told me that Porter said to you that you had a responsibility. There was something special that you could do. Could you talk about that a little bit?
well, both Professor Herring, who founded the art department, it was the first major art department at a black institution, at Howard University in 1921, and he remained chairman of that department until 1953, so I overlapped with him. And he was a cantankerous old man that just, if you weren't really the best, he didn't even want to speak to you. I remember I was painting away at this portrait, and he came through the classroom. I didn't know who he was because we weren't introduced to the chairman. And I was painting a young lady, portrait of a young lady, and she had on a blue sweater and everything. And I really thought I was doing pretty good. And he came over and he pointed to the arm. He said, "You'll never paint a better seascape in your whole life than what you painted there." And I'm like, who is this character? So this was James Vernon Lee Alphonsus Joseph Augustus Herring. And we would recite his whole name when we wanted to embarrass him. Professor James Vernon Lee Alphonsus Joseph Augustus Herring, why did you say such and such a thing? And by that time he was angry with us. But he was a good chairperson. He was good. He brought the arts center front at Howard University, and he hired good people. He hired Porter, who had been one of his students. He brought Wells in from the Harlem Workshop up in Harlem. He brought Lois Jones there from the girls' school down in Sedalia, North Carolina. And he hired good people. But he didn't, these were brilliant minds, all at that one institution. They had no place to go. Harvard didn't want them.
Sure.
Yale didn't want them. The first people to break out were people like John Hope Franklin, going to Brooklyn and Chicago and places like that. They didn't have any room for black professors. So they were there fighting amongst themselves. And you said I was like kind of chosen. Yeah, I was there. I had a little talent. So Porter came to me and he said, and he very seldom did this, he said, "It's noble and wonderful you want to be a painter, and you're going to be a good painter." He said, "But you have a good mind, and you ought to study art history as well." He said, "Because we need you to help define the field." So I was at least smart enough to know that he was, in a sense, passing the mantle.
He was mentoring, sure.
It was mentorship that he meant.
And soon after graduation, you had your first position was at Talladega and then Fisk?
Talladega, I was very fortunate, and thanks to Porter for helping me write the letters. I wrote my first letter to Talladega College, Talladega, Florida. And Professor Porter said, "I don't think it's in Florida." But I said it out anyway. And in those days, you didn't have this automated mail system. So the letter went to Florida, and the postman marked it out and said, "Try Alabama." And it went to Alabama, Talladega College in Alabama. And the president, Dr. Arthur Gray, got that letter through all of that, and he wrote back. Now, I have a bachelor's degree. I don't have a master's. I'm going to teach college. I had these grand ideas from day one, believing in myself.
Sure.
And so he wrote back, and he said, "Regrettably, we don't have an opening, but we'll keep your letter on file." So about 2 months later in the summer, Dr. Gray writes back again, and he says, our art professor, Mr. Claude Clark,
Yeah.
has decided to leave. He's going to Oakland, California to go back to graduate school. Would you be interested in coming? And I said, yes. You know, my wife and I, we had 2 little girls. And as far as I was concerned, I was ready to teach. So I go down and he said, well, can you teach drawing? Yes. Can you teach painting? Yes. Can you teach ceramics? Yes. Hadn't had a ceramic course. And went down the line. Of course, I bought a ceramic book that night and started studying ceramics. And I stayed a page ahead of my students. Mm-hmm. But I was so devoted to that teaching job that I learned to take my students out to the red clay of Alabama, to dig it, to process it, to fire it, to make our own glazes. And I sent students who were like economic majors to Cranbrook Academy for their MFA. So I say today, those people who say, well, isn't it time for us to close the HBCUs? No, no, no. Those HBCUs are still fulfilling a function. Those kids can't come to Ohio State University. They wouldn't qualify to come.
Sure.
But if you give them a chance, they will work their way up.
Sure.
And then they'll come to graduate school at Ohio State University. So they're still functional, they're still needed. And that was the
Just
kind of
needed
environment
opportunity.
that when I left Howard, I went into. But I taught those courses, and I think I taught them pretty good, well.
And then you went on to Fisk.
I went on, I went to back to Howard to teach. And I taught at Howard and became acting chair there when Porter went to Africa. And I left Howard in 1966 to go to Fisk.
And now Aaron Douglas was at Fisk at this time.
Aaron was at Fisk. He was retiring, and so I took Aaron's place. But Anna Bontemps was still there. Langston Hughes would still come down to visit Anna Bontemps and his wife. So I had made the acquaintance of Langston Hughes when I was a student by working at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery. Mm-hmm. But he wouldn't have remembered me from Adam, you know. But when he came back to Howard to receive an honorary degree in 1963, the dean of the college asked if I would drive him around the city. And so I did. I wasn't driving a taxi then. Mm-hmm. I had my own car. Mm-hmm. So I drove him around. He wanted to go back to see the hotel where he stayed over near the Calvert Street Bridge. I took him over there. And then he wanted to go see Georgia Douglas Johnson, the last of the Harlem Renaissance poets who had moved to Washington. And she lived down on 13th Street near T Street. And he said to me before we got there, he said, now, she is going to have lemonade in her refrigerator. She's going to have peppermint candy. And he outlined all the things that she would have. He said the lemonade is going to be cloudy. He said, because she will have had it for a long time. And it was like, don't drink it. He said, the peppermint candy is going to be pink. The stripes will be gone. She said she's had that since she worked for Booker T. Washington. He said, don't eat it. So we get to her house on 13th Street, which I think they're trying to make into a national treasure now. This doesn't have anything to do with my being an artist, but, you know, it fits in the Harlem Renaissance thing. And we go in, and you can't get into her living room because she has books and papers and piled up in the door. So you had to go all the way back to the kitchen and come through the dining room. Dining room was clouded up with books and things. And as you get into the kitchen, there's this refrigerator with that big round thing on top, making noise, you know, going and so forth. And so we go in the living room and we sit down. Here, sure enough, here comes the lemonade. Here comes the candy. And so I'm saying, now, how are we going to do this thing? And he said, well, when she goes back to the kitchen, we'll pour the lemonade in the flowers. Mm-hmm. These are the little things, you know. Now, here's this great poet, poet laureate of Black America, Langston Hughes, and he is conniving and telling me how to not get sick drinking this lemonade. So when Georgia Douglas Johnson, prominent name in Harlem Renaissance literature, she goes in the kitchen and so we pour the lemonade in the flowers, and of course we've hidden the candy by that time. And so she comes back, she's more lemonade, you know, and so that's how we got out of drinking the lemonade. But to sit there and hear them talk about James Weldon Johnson, Zora Neale Hurston, and Charlotte Osgood Mason, the famous, the woman who really was the underwriter for much of the Harlem Renaissance, the white woman whose people owned the big department stores in New York, and she had money to burn, and how she maneuvered to make this thing the way she wanted it. They had to do it undercover to make it theirs, because she
Didn't you
paid.
tell me Langston would have to go out with her at night and
Oh yes,
accompany
yes.
her?
He would have to be locked arm in arm with her at times. But, you know, that was the tenor of the time.
The patronage system.
She was the patron. And you had other patrons like Mary Beatty Brady of the Harmon Foundation. But Miss Brady didn't have as much money, and she was very selective.
But plenty of attitude.
And a lot of attitude, yes. And she wore hats, so she had attitude.
Attitude, okay. So you also received one of the last awards from the Harmon Foundation.
One of the last awards, and in 1964, and to my recollection, because the foundation closed in '67, I don't think they gave money to any other. And they had sponsored Palmer Hayden as early as Palmer Hayden and Woodruff and people like that.
Yes, our Harmon
And
Renaissance title in this.
and Palmer is represented in your exhibitions. A beautiful work of his in the exhibition of People on the Subway. And I was saying to Will, I don't think the subway has changed in New York. It's the same, you know, it's that impersonal, you know, thing of getting on the subway, everybody doing their own thing.
So talk a little bit about this patronage system. It wasn't just black artistry. There were patrons like Carl Van Vechten, Mary Brady, and others. I know there were actors that were very supportive. Edgar Robertson was very supportive of the arts, and others. Lena Horne, not Lena Horne, but Lena Turner, the actress, was very supportive of arts by blacks. So it was something that was really broad.
But they were patrons on their own terms.
Okay.
This was not a black-owned.
So it was entertaining to them in some ways.
Yes, it was still. It hadn't moved from the level of entertainment. It was like, you know, it was a higher level, but it was almost like the slave owner on the plantation saying, "Sing me a ditty."
Got it.
And they, you know, and the slaves would sing. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going. You know, that reverse psychology. Well, Langston and all the others, they needed patronage. So, and Aaron Douglas told me, he said, yeah, he said, we had no other means of funding. He said they were so particular about how you could get onto WPA and so forth, and somebody could report on you and you'd be off. And so Charlotte Osgood Mason, her money, they could go places, they could do things.
Yeah, I know Langston used to stay in cottages on private estates to write.
Yes.
Yeah, he was looked after in many ways. But Mary Brady also had a you know, sort of a complicated relationship with patronage and support of artists. I understood that artists would have to present works to her satisfaction.
And she would collect the works. She'd give them a little money for them, and for the time, it was decent money, I guess. But she built up the largest collection of works by black artists in that period. And that's why the Harmon works, if you go to the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington. Used to be called the National Collection of Fine Arts. That's what it was called when she gave the works in 1970. The foundation closed down. She gave over 1,100 works by William H. Johnson alone to Smithsonian. Nobody, regardless of what you say about the patronage or how Mary Beatty Brady ran the Harmon Foundation, who saved 1,100 works by William H. Johnson?
Right.
You got to look at it from both points of view. And, but they were given on her own terms. Like you mentioned Talladega. When I was at Talladega College, I wanted to do a show of the works of African-American artists in 1958 for the Fine Arts Festival. And I wrote to Miss Brady, and she willingly sent, about 45 or 50 works. And I remember the president praising her, saying these works have been sent to Talladega College, but he hadn't seen the fine print in the letter of the gift at the time. It said, during the incumbency of David C. Driscoll. Mm-hmm. And Miss Brady always did that. If she liked you, she would point out, yes, these works come to you at Fisk, come to you so and so, but you better read the fine print. If I left, the works had to leave.
Going with you. Well, there were other patrons that did this too, supported the institutions, like at Fisk, the gifts from Alfred Stieglitz and George O'Keeffe.
Yeah.
I know they gave a large collection, and you were in charge of the art gallery when you were at Fisk.
Yes.
There came a time when the works had been given, with the understanding that they would never be shown any other location. And then you received notice from George O'Keeffe that she wanted to borrow some works for an exhibition?
Yes, one of the conditions of the gift in 1949, Mr. Stieglitz died in 1946. And so, Miss O'Keeffe was a very political person. She was a cultural icon, but politics was also there. Mm. And she was a mover and a shaker when it came to that kind of cultural enterprise. And she told me that she placed, people say, why would she give 101 works, Blue Period Picasso, Renoir, Cézanne, you name it, 10 Marsden Hartley's and so forth. So nothing like it in the South. Why would she give 101 works to a little black school in 1949 in Tennessee? And she told me, she said, first of all, because it was a cultural gift. Black students needed to know about these artists like everybody else. She said, but she also placed it there because the white people across at Vanderbilt and Peabody and all of the Sedity schools would have to come across the railroad track to see the works. And she said, let them be humbled and come and see greatness. So for all those years, for 20 years, of course, white community refused to come over there. They preferred ignorance. Mm-hmm. And so they stayed over there and showed inferior works. Mm. They could have come across the street and seen a Blue Period Picasso. They didn't do that. So Georgia O'Keeffe proved her point. But she also tied the collection down where she said, you can't loan it, you can't sell it. I don't know what Miss Walton did, but they did something, and it's partial ownership now between Fisk and Crystal Bridges Museum. I'm not going to say anything unkind about it because, Walmart has been buying art. Mm-hmm. So
a lot of it, yes.
You can be bought off if you pay the right price. I'm not saying that for real, but
she's cleaning that up. But let's get to Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, she says to you, she needs to borrow this painting. Radiator, is it Radiator Building?
Yeah. I had gone to her in 1966 and said, the works are in bad condition, they need to be conserved. They hadn't been cleaned, and you could go to the linoleum on the floor, and there was Miss O'Keeffe's red mark still there in front of the Blue Period Picasso, in front of the Maudson Hartley, and so forth and so on. They just waxed over it, and so the works, no air conditioning, no humidity control, and nothing like that. So I said, we need to improve upon the quality of the place and the care of the works. So I've gone to the Wilderstein Gallery in New York, and they've promised me a prominent place to have a benefit. Can we do it? And she says, no. She writes back and she says, my dear Mr. Driscoll, Stieglitz never felt that the works improved with travel, and so forth and so on. So 2 years later, 1966, she's planning for her big retrospective at the Whitney. And I get a call from Miss Doris Bree, who was her assistant, and she said, Miss O'Keeffe wants to borrow a radiator building for the upcoming exhibition at the Whitney. And I said, well, tell her to put it in writing, send me a letter. So she did. And I wrote back and I said, my dear Miss O'Keeffe, I must remind you of the stringency of your gift. Regrettably, the works can't be loaned. Well, I knew I hadn't met her at that time, and my plan was to meet her.
And you knew that letter would provoke the meeting?
Yes. And it did. And so I get a call from Miss Bree, and I don't know if anybody in here ever met Miss Doris Bree. You'd never forget her. She was about 6'2" in heels. And she looked down on little men like me. Mm-hmm. And she kind of nasalized when she talked. And she called me up and she said, Mr. Driscoll, Miss O'Keeffe wishes to see you in New York immediately. And I thought, yeah. So Miss O'Keeffe always stayed at the Stanhope Hotel right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum. So I go up and I walk in, and she has on the black dress with the white collar and the medallion and so forth. And I always say, what are you going to say to an American icon? What do you say? You meet somebody, and I said, oh, Miss O'Keeffe, I said, look so beautiful just as you did in those early photographs. She didn't, but she was still Miss O'Keeffe. She was an American icon. So she said, oh, you like the brooch? She said, and it said, if you look on the photographs, it says, okay. It's a silver medallion, And I said, oh, yes. She said, Sandy made it for me. And of course, luckily I knew who Sandy was, Alexander Calder. So I didn't call him Sandy. I said, oh, Mr. Calder did a great job on that. I just, reveled her up and everything. She said, well, maybe you like it. Maybe someday I'll give it to you. And Miss Bree stood up and said, Miss O'Keeffe, we're giving away nothing today. And that kind of dampened my spirits. But I said, now I'm a sharecropper from Georgia. And my people knew how to survive, to get through segregation and all that kind of stuff. Now I got an answer for her. And so I said, well, let me tell you about the condition of the works and so forth and so on. And I said, Miss O'Keeffe, you know what? It was noble of you to place these works, 101 major works, including the 2 that you did, at a black institution in 1949. I said, but Miss O'Keeffe, you didn't endow them. What did you expect was going to happen to the works? And she looked at me. She said, you got guts. She said, but I like you. She said, now what do you want from me? And I said, I want $50,000. I want so and so and so. And I had it all laid out. And by that time, Miss Bree was just melting down. And she turned to Miss Bree And she said, Doris, she'd forgotten my name. She said, I want Mr. Fisk to have a check tomorrow for $50,000 to restore those works. We had special delivery back in those days. Mm-hmm. We didn't have this new mail, whatever it is. And the check came.
It was there by the time you got there, huh?
And I had an agreement with John Spencer, who was director of the National Endowment for the Arts then. And you know, and I say to the young people, the artists out there now, you just can't be an artist and stay behind that canvas. You got to learn to be a business person. You got to learn to articulate, to talk the language. You can't just stand there and make pretty pictures. The world doesn't operate that way. You got to learn more than that.
Sure.
And so, Ms. O'Keefe listened to me and gave that money. John Spencer, I had an agreement. He was director of NEA at that time. He said, I will go to my discretionary fund and match whatever
if you
Ms.
can
O'Keefe.
get it.
We restored those works, and it was the very first time they had ever been restored. That was the part of the episode. But the last time I saw her was at her opening at the Whitney in 1970. And they had they had dinners all over New York, you know, the collective celebrating her being in town. I was not invited to the dinner where she was, but I was invited to one of the major dinners there on Fifth Avenue because I was a lender. Mm-hmm. I had loaned a work. So I arrived, people were in there, you know, turkey suits and now doing all the things. And I arrived and this is New York City now. I hope there's nobody in here from New York. But I'm coming in from Nashville, and I have on my little tuxedo. Everybody arriving in limousines and what have you, on Fifth Avenue and all that. And I get out, I arrive in my taxi, and I get out, and the doorman greets me on Fifth Avenue in the 1000 block of Fifth Avenue. And he says, "Are you reporting to work, sir?" 1970 in New York City. And I said, "No, I'm a guest of the Marcellus, and isn't it your responsibility as a servant here to show me to the elevator?" And of course, "Yes, sir," and he did. And I went up, and then the conversation ensued about segregation in the South. Like, come on.
Yeah, that was a conversation upstairs.
Upstairs, with all that high china.
Mm-hmm. So this patronage system was very critical because Brady arranged for exhibitions to come to Fisk, and this also is where you develop your first plans for 2 centuries of African American art, which was a seminal text, an exhibition that traveled, I think, to 4 locations.
Four
Started out at LACMA,
Los Angeles County Museum of Art.
At the largest attendance record in that history. 80,000 people came to the exhibition. It was the first comprehensive exhibition of African American artists put together. Then it went on to the High Museum.
High Museum in
Then it went to, was it Dallas?
The Dallas Museum.
And then Brooklyn Museum.
And ended at the Brooklyn Museum opening in July of 1977.
And they had you all over the world doing interviews and filming. And it was
most importantly, I think, was the interview that Tom Brokaw did with me on Today's Show on July 4th. 1977. He was in Europe just prior to that, and I forget the gentleman's name. He wanted to do the interview. He used to be on the Today Show with a big beard and a big head of hair and so forth. And anyway, he wanted to do that, and Tom Brokaw said, no, I want to interview him. And so I arrived for my interview, and Brokaw, in his interview, said to me, well, he was talking about black art and so forth and so on. He said, but Hilton Kramer, you know, the leading critic in America at the time, the New York Times. Kramer had literally put the show down, saying there was such thing as black art, and what is he talking about, and blah, blah, blah. You know, he went on. But he had to take 3/4 of a page in the New York Times to say that and put me down. And my chairman in Maryland by that time, and I went in the office that morning, and he said, "You made the New York Times. You know, nobody has made it before." You know, I said, "But look what he said." "It doesn't matter what they said. You made the New York Times." Well, but Kramer said, you know, first of all, no such thing as black art, no such thing as women's art. I said, "Well, I didn't create those titles." I said, "Because of your sociological classification, and because we have to categorize everything, why can't we just say it's art? I'd like for it to just be American art, but no. I'm going to make sure it's in the compendium. And if it takes calling it black art to do that, I'm going to call it black art." And so Brokaw says to me, "But Hilton Kramer says so and so." And I very innocently said, "Who is Hilton Kramer?" on national television. And of course, I knew that would start a fight. So Kramer lit into me.
Oh, that was on then, huh?
Like white on rice. And so by that, Sam Hunter over at Princeton had written about, in a book, he devoted 12 pages.
This was the premier historian in the country.
Yes, 12 pages to 2 centuries. So Hilton Kramer, you know, 2 weeks later, right? Why would a reputable historian like Sam Hunter write about so and so and so? So my response was, "Mr. Kramer, please, don't you know what you're doing? All you're doing is keeping my name in the New York Times. I'm becoming famous. Keep it up."
Well, it did make you famous.
It didn't make me famous.
Yeah.
No.
Well, the book, the publication, and the exhibition was critical because I've been in the company of David where so many prominent historians have pointed out that their careers were based on that book and what David had did. He had given them inspiration. And that refers back to the lunch we were talking about earlier about the ideal that how do you inspire someone? By showing it, by doing it, and by witnessing. That's how you do it. I'm going to close because I know we have some time for questions. If I don't, David's going to keep on doing this. We'll be here all night long. You can see where he received an award, the National Medal for Humanities from President Clinton, to acknowledge and celebrate his distinct achievements as a singular man. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
So we're going to do 2 things. Dr. Driscoll will take a few questions, and then also we're going to have refreshments at the back, so we can all also go to the back, and we'll all be standing. I think Dr. Driscoll and Dr. Holton would stay with us for a little while. But does anyone want a question before we sort of go more informal?
Are his books for sale in the gallery?
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
If I got my act together, it would be so, sir.
Well, Dorit Yaron is the deputy director of the Driscoll Center, and she can facilitate that for you.
If they aren't there now, they will.
She will make sure they're there for you.
I had one question. I'm always admire people who are, and when your professor said to you, you're talented as an artist, but we also need your mind to define the field. I'm always a little sad that I know in the art museum business too, there are fewer, it used to be that art museums were filled with artists who were also arts administrators and curators, and this kind of cross-pollination between like art history, art, and, you know, and museum work. I'm sort of sad that that's less than it used to be. Do you see that that's a challenge for the future?
Oh, definitely. It's a challenge, and it's, we've compartmentalized things so now. You have to become a specialist in that particular thing, and you can't be. And I go back to the HBCUs. You couldn't be a specialist in those schools. And I was jokingly saying at lunch, when I came to the University of Maryland, and this is factual, but it was almost within the context of a joke. When I came to the University of Maryland in 1977 to teach, there was one black full professor out of the 2,000 faculty members. I was the very second. And this whole thing about who is prepared, who is ready to do such and such a thing, and I'd come from HBCUs. I had taught at 3 HBCUs prior to that. And I come to Maryland, a faculty, art faculty of 46 people, art historians and studio people, but everybody specialized. Now, they were specializing in things that I, at Talladega, at Fisk, and at Howard, had to teach across the board. So, to a certain extent, you lose something when that becomes such a specialty, and people stop talking to each other because they're not in the same field. Gets so bad sometimes the painters don't talk to the sculptors. Ad Reinhardt said, sculpture, that's something you back into when you're looking at paintings. And it's almost that way, like we don't really connect. We're all there together, and we're losing some of that in the sense that this is my field, this is my area. I don't know what the answer is now that we have gone tech. That's pushed us even further. And as I was leaving, I supposedly retired from teaching at University of Maryland 20 years ago. Doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it has, because I still go up there. Mm-hmm. He makes me come on campus by being director of the Driscoll Center. I can't deny my name.
That's right.
So I have to go up there. But they were putting in computers all over the place when I was leaving. This is 20 years ago now. And now you say, you don't have a computer in your office? Well, and I said, no, don't put one in my office. I'm leaving. And I got left behind in a lot of that technology. I can text and do a few of those things. But don't ask me to do a lot of that other stuff. And
that's pretty recent, because, a few years ago, I got a text. I said, David Driscoll is sending me a text. He knows how to do this.
So I say this, I have to go around the barn to answer the question. When I was teaching the students, they'd say to me, but Professor Driscoll, you were talking about something. I said, oh, yes, okay. I'll get back to that. If you lived 87 and a half years, all that stuff is still there. Mm-hmm. And it's just jumping on you. And when are you going to say it? When are you going to use it? How much time you have left to use it? All that, you try and get it all in one sentence. It doesn't make sense. But I very often get distracted by trying to bring the experience of all these things together. But finally, I'll simply say it's something that we do studies on everything. We ought to do some studies on the practicality of that and say that served us well at a given time when it was happening that way. I had a colleague at Howard, at Fisk, Professor Earl Hooks. He was a wonderful ceramics teacher. And well-read, and I often thought, well, he's outread me when it comes to the Greek philosophers and things. He'd quote Plato and Aristotle and so forth. I'd go get me a book and like, what is he talking about, And Professor Hooks, though, would go off on little tangents. And he'd be talking about something, and then he'd just stop and say, And you say, Professor Hooks, he didn't hear you. Professor Hooks? And he said, oh, did you say something? You know, and my teaching very often was beginning to reflect that. So I said, no, it's time to stop. Time to stop.
But keep in mind that David has also had a distinguished career as a painter when we talked about making that choice. His work is currently at Brooklyn, a part of the Soul of a Nation exhibition. He has a retrospective that will start in 2 years, begins at the High Museum, goes to the Phillips, Portland Museum, then the Perez Museum in honor of his 90th birthday. So he's always practiced at the same time that he has done his work as art historian. One question, I think?
Yes. Hi. My name is Demetrius David, and growing up, I was inspired by the Harlem Renaissance, particularly the poets, at a personal level. Could you speak to the collective impact that the Harlem Renaissance period had on America? We hear about the history, the purpose, the intent, but I want to hear something about like the collective impact on America.
Well, it has, oh boy, that's a big one, because so many people have been influenced. I have experienced it vicariously in the sense that, as Professor Holton said, I'm a child of the Renaissance in that I knew the second generation people. I interacted with them. I was fortunate to have known Aaron Douglas, and Allen Locke called him the father of the Negro Renaissance movement amongst visual artists. And I knew him because of our relationship at Fisk and because of the work he'd done with the murals at so many different places. But in the sense that the mantle was passed down to so many different people, it was the kind of thing that has impacted, let's just say society, period. Let's not distinguish it and say black society. It's impacted society in certain ways, so that you can't really talk about American literature in its fullness without talking about Richard Wright or Zora Neale Hurston, and of course in poetry like Langston Hughes. And Langston always said that he was not trying to be poet laureate. He was trying to be a spokesperson for the people. And he said when he wrote about simple, he was talking about the average person. And I'll tell you a story he told me. If you ever come to Washington, there are a series of restaurants called Bus Boys and Poets. Okay. When I was driving Langston around in June of 1963, he wanted to go to what he called the Wardman Park Hotel, which is the big hotel up on the hill. It's, what is the name of it now? It's one of those corporate names now, where College Art Association meeting was a couple of years ago. So I drove him up there, and he said, I was a bus boy here in this hotel. And he said, I was washing dishes and collecting dishes one night, and he said, I came in here and I saw the writer for the Washington Post who writes about poetry and literature and so forth. And he said, I ran back into the room with the dishes and took a napkin and scribbled a poem out and took it back and handed it to the writer and put it where he was. And a couple of days later, the writer wrote in his column in the Washington Post I was at the Wardman Hotel, Park Hotel last night, and a Negro bus boy brought me a poem. He is destined to be a poet. So when you come to Washington and you go to the about 4 or 5 of the
Busboys
restaurant
and
chain,
Poets, yeah.
Busboy and Poets, that's the origin of that name.
So it echoes. Yeah, it keeps echoing.
It kind of echoes that, it gets out there where it's real. It's the word made real, you know. So,
All right, thank you. And David will be available to talk.
thank you.